what I'm going to do in this presentation, as Graham's alluded to, is talk about, draw on what I've written about in the What Are Qualitative Research Ethics books that Graham's mentioned. And this is very much an introductory book about qualitative ethics in social research. So what am I going to do in this presentation? Firstly, I want to try to unpack what we mean by ethics in qualitative social research. And to do that, I'm going to explore some of the frameworks there are for helping researchers to engage with the ethical issues and ethical dilemmas that they might encounter in their research. My argument is that having knowledge of these frameworks is really helpful in helping researchers to engage with the kind of everyday issues, but perhaps more importantly, the more complex dilemmas that we experience in our research. Obviously, I'm going to give a very brief introduction to these frameworks, but hopefully it will be helpful in just introducing them to you if you don't know about them already. So the four frameworks I'm going to briefly focus on are principlism, consequentialism, the ethics of care framework, and virtue ethics. And I'm going to finish by giving an example of a particular ethical dilemma, quite a complex ethical dilemma, I think, which some researchers experienced, and just to illustrate how they resolved this dilemma. And this draws on, the resolution of it draws on several of these frameworks, so I hope this will help to illustrate how these frameworks might be able to be used. Okay, so what are ethics? Ethics are generally thought of as principles for guiding moral behaviour, for distinguishing between what is the right thing to do in any situation, and perhaps what's the wrong thing to do in a situation, perhaps as depicted by the picture on the left-hand side of that screen. There's a right decision, there's a wrong decision, and ethics can help you to reach conclusion about those. But obviously, in life and in social research in particular, things are much more complex than that. And making ethical decisions often involves researchers weighing up a range of possible decisions that they might make, possible outcomes, and weighing up what the benefit and harm of those particular decisions might be. So thinking about particular courses of action and what might be the right thing to do in a situation. Now, the decisions that researchers, so the picture on the right-hand side of the screen is perhaps a better one for depicting how one deals with dilemmas in social research, in qualitative social research. The decisions that researchers make are inevitably individual. In that individual researchers might reach different conclusions about the same particular dilemma that they're encountering. But at the same time, the decisions that researchers make are very much influenced by the cultural context in which we're working, and by society's moral views about rightness and wrongness. So, for example, all researchers would agree they shouldn't conduct research which would inflict harm on their participants, but researchers might disagree about what harm is and how that is best managed. And I'm just going to give an example to give an illustration of this. So this is an example of an ethical dilemma which a researcher talked to us about in some research that we conducted on informed consent. And this researcher was conducting work in a school context with young people, and she was exploring school-based friendships, and she was using participatory and child-friendly research methods. And the process for consent which she'd developed was that she wanted a consent form signed by the child who was taking part in the research, but also their parents. And children were giving these consent forms to take home to their parents and to bring them back into school. So on the day the research was to take place, and the research was taking place during the school day, one particular child brought in their form, and it was clear that the parent's signature had been forged. And the child said, no, they hadn't forged it, but it was fairly obvious that it had been. And the child was very keen to take part in the research and said, oh, all my friends are taking part, you know, I'm just going to feel really left out if I can't do this. So what should the researcher do in this situation? Should they overlook the fact that that consent was forged, given the research didn't pose any risk to the child, or and in fact excluding them might be judged to be more harmful because they were going to feel very left out. Or should they go along with what they had agreed that they would do? They didn't have consent from the parents, so the child couldn't take part. So some researchers obviously might view it as appropriate to override the parental consent in interest of the child's well-being. But others might view the issue of parental consent to be paramount. And there's also the issue if presumably this researcher had approval from a research ethics committee where they'd set out what they were going to do, and also from the school, probably from the head teacher. So the right answer to that dilemma isn't particularly clear. People may make different decisions about it. Obviously, it would be a matter of balancing the potential for risk and harm for the child, for the parents, for the school, for the researcher, perhaps for the researcher's institution, weighing up all the various different parties and what impact that decision might have. So, as I've said in this presentation, I want to put forward the view that ethical frameworks are useful in helping researchers to think about ethical dilemmas such as these and others that we encounter in our research, particularly for quite complex ethical dilemmas for which there isn't a one right answer. Some researchers have argued that ethical decisions are very much situational and contextual, that you have to make decisions in the context of the research that you're undertaking, your particular participants, what the context is. And I don't disagree with that at all. So some researchers say, well, you can't look at these frameworks because they just tell you what to do and it all depends. And I don't disagree with that view, but I don't think that having knowledge of ethical frameworks prevents you from making those kind of contextual decisions, if you like. I think consideration of ethical frameworks don't provide clear answers to dilemmas, but they do provide a means of thinking about them and assessing what an appropriate and I think defensible course of action might be. So I'm going to, obviously the decisions that researchers make are not solely theirs to make, and research decisions are influenced by a whole range of other factors, and I've just listed on this slide just some of the things that influence the decisions that researchers make. So obviously ethical regulation is a key factor. Researchers are generally obliged to comply with whatever regulation exists in their institution, and this also would include research governance as well as research ethics committees. But their decisions are also shaped by any guidelines or codes that they work to and disciplinary norms. But even recognising that there are these constraints on the decisions that researchers make, I think at the same time researchers need to be able to think through and prepare for the ethical issues that they might encounter in their research, and perhaps more importantly from those that arise as their research proceeds, and I think these ethical frameworks can help with that. So, I'm going to talk about 4 frameworks, as I've said, and the first one is the Principlist approach. This is the framework most commonly used in research ethics, and most researchers tend to make some reference to at least some of the principles contained in this framework. It's also the framework that tends to inform the evaluation by research ethics committees, and it also informs the various guidelines and codes, professional guidelines and codes that researchers work to. So it's based on 4 principles. The first is respect for autonomy, and this comprises informed consent, i.e. that participants need to be fully aware of what participating in a study will involve and to freely consent to it. The issue of voluntariness, that research participants shouldn't be under any pressure to take part in research, such as might be involved if there's a power relationship between the researcher and the participant, or if there's some inducement, some money involved as part of taking part in the research, or gift tokens or such like. And it also comprises the issues of confidentiality and anonymity, that in general information that participants give will be kept confidential, or at least their name won't be linked to it, and you won't be telling anyone else what they have said in a way that identifies them. The second principle within this framework is that of beneficence, that the research should do good of some type, that there should be some benefit from conducting the research, either to individuals or to society more broadly. And that links to the third principle of non-maleficence, that to do no harm, that participants shouldn't be at risk of harm from participating in research. And then the final principle is that of justice, that the burdens and benefits of research should be distributed equally amongst a population. It shouldn't just be focusing on a particular population that take part in research and benefit from it, but also have the burden of it. So these principles, although they've been criticised by some social researchers as being a very strong framework that constrains research for social researchers, given this approach was actually developed initially for researchers working in medical research. But I think this framework is a starting point for thinking about ethical dilemmas. So I think if you use it, it doesn't mean that confidentiality can't be breached, for example, or that people can't be paid for participating in research. Rather, these principles form the starting point for thinking about the various issues that one is encountering. Okay, the second framework I'm going to briefly identify is that of consequentialism. Consequentialist approaches argue that ethical decisions should be based on the consequences or outcomes of particular actions rather than on specific principles. So an action is morally right if it will produce a good outcome for an individual or more commonly for a broader group of society. Using this kind of an approach, a researcher would assess what the outcome of a specific decision might be and decide on an action that they believe would result in the most beneficial outcome for an individual or, as I've said, more usually wider society. So, for example, using this approach, a researcher might argue that it's appropriate to conduct covert research, perhaps, for example, on youth crime, if that could be seen as benefiting society more broadly. And similarly, a researcher might argue that it's morally right to disclose confidential data from one participant if that would be seen as benefiting a wider group of people. Okay, the third framework I want to just outline is that of ethics of care approach. This approach was identified by Carol Gilligan and has been used and developed by a number of feminist theorists, and it also forms the basis of work for many researchers who work in a participatory paradigm. In this approach, ethical decisions are made on the basis of care, compassion, and a desire to act in ways that benefit the individual or group who are part of the research, who are the focus of the research. And it also acknowledges and recognises the interdependency of researchers and the communities that they research, so not just their research participants, but the communities from which those participants come from. There are 3 points that are central to this approach. Firstly, it stresses the need for researchers to make decisions on the basis of the very specific project in which they're working. So it's not about universal principles that apply to all research, but it's very much a situational type of approach. Secondly, as I said, it stresses the need for care and compassion to be central in the ethical decisions that are made, care and compassion to research participants. And thirdly, and importantly, it also stresses the need for these notions of care and compassion to extend to all parties who are affected by the research, not just those who are participants. So it stresses the importance of exploring the different views of people in relation to an ethical dilemma from all parties in making ethical decisions. Okay, the final framework that I want to outline is that of virtue ethics. And this is a person-based approach. So it focuses on the virtue or moral character of the researcher rather than on ethical principles or the specific situation of the research. Virtue ethic draws on the notion of researcher integrity and seeks to identify the characteristics or virtues that a researcher needs in order to conduct research in ethically or morally good ways. So this slide is taken from Bruce McFarlane's book on virtue ethics. It's a really useful book if that's something that you're interested in. And on the left-hand side of the screen there, he's identified the various different phases of research, of a research project, starting from when you design the research, which he's called framing, right through the process of gaining access to your participants, data collection, analysing your data, writing it up, and then looking back on the project when you've completed it. And in bold, sort of in the middle of the screen, he's identified the virtues you need at each stage of that research project in order to deal with the challenges that emerge at those different phases. And he's also identified the vices that might be there if there's a deficit of the virtue or an excess of the virtue. So in relation to the creating stage of the research, by which he means the stage when you're drawing your findings together, beginning to write them up, beginning to, analysing them, he says the virtue that's needed is sincerity, and the vice would be concealment, so concealing some data, not including that because it doesn't quite fit with your story, and the excess would be exaggerating, so exaggerating some findings to try to make a stronger point. So obviously these virtues are things to aim for rather than things that are easy to obtain. And these vices are what happens when there's a kind of deficit, when these ideals can't be met. So in relation to ethical dilemmas, using this approach, a virtuous researcher would try to consider what a virtuous researcher would do in any given situation. So that outlines those four frameworks quite briefly, but I hope has given you a bit of a feel for them. So how can researchers use these in making ethical decisions? So this slide is taken from Israel and Hayes' book on research ethics, and they outline a 7-step process that researchers can go through particularly when they encounter a quite complex ethical dilemma. Clearly one wouldn't necessarily want to do this for an everyday ethical dilemma perhaps. This particular approach, these steps, also involves incorporating these frameworks. So in step 5 they talk about, so they identify thinking about what the problem is, who's involved, thinking about various options, thinking about the consequences of different options, and then considering your options with reference to moral principles such as honesty, trust, autonomy, fairness, equality, and all these principles are contained in some way in those frameworks. And then to integrate these consequences and principles to reach an independent and, importantly, a justifiable decision. So I've kind of skated over that a bit because I want to move on to my example, which I will just give a good illustration of how these frameworks can be used. So the example I want to use is drawn from a research project conducted by Ros Edwards and Susie Weller as part of the Timescapes project. And you can find all the details of this particular dilemma on the Timescapes website, and I'll put the link up in a minute. The focus of the project was on young people's relationships with siblings and friends, and it involved repeated interviews with young people over a 7-year period. During the course of the final set of interviews, just before the final set of interviews in fact, one of the research participants, the young people, unexpectedly died. And this gave rise to considerable ethical dilemma around consent and confidentiality. And the project researchers put a message on the Timescapes website which went to the other researchers doing projects in the same programme to ask for their views about how they might resolve this ethical dilemma. So firstly, I'm going to outline, this is an excerpt from what they posted on the website to other researchers in the programme about the ethical dilemma in relation to consent, and I'll say a bit about the confidentiality one in a minute. So the participant that they called Dan, he'd verbally agreed to all the data which they'd previously collected being archived, but the researchers had planned at the last interview to have consent to archiving forms, to distribute those forms, and for the participants to sign those. So before, they'd only had verbal consent. And Dan died just before that happened, so he hadn't signed the form. So the question they asked was whether they could go ahead and archive the data anyway on the basis of his verbal consent 2 years previously, or should they ask Dan's parents if they would sign this form on Dan's behalf. But they were concerned that this might imply that they had some sense of ownership over the data already collected. And so they were questioning, could Dan's parents demand to have the data? Could they refuse for it to be used? So obviously if they demanded to see the data, there were issues of confidentiality there, the promise of confidentiality given to Dan. If they refused permission, that would override Dan's verbal consent given some time previously. Quite a difficult issue to resolve, and a number of possibles. The second part of the dilemma related to confidentiality, and the researchers viewed this very much as a moral issue with which they were engaging. They felt that given Dan's very sudden and unexpected death, that they had something material of Dan's. They had all these interviews, and that his parents probably would really like to hear some of these interviews. So they kind of felt that in some way they're under a moral obligation perhaps to provide something that was of a non-sensitive nature that they might like to have, given his very sudden and unexpected death. Obviously making that offer of some of that data would go against the promise of confidentiality that they'd given to Dan, which is problematic. But that might be seen as acceptable in the circumstances, provided the data they gave was of a very non-sensitive nature. But it raised the issue, obviously, of what should they provide, how could they decide what was non-sensitive, if you like, and whose moral rights should have precedence? Should it be Dan's rights that had precedence, or his parents'? So, as I say, they posted this on their website, and they got 11 responses from researchers involved in the programme. And as one might expect, there were a whole wide range of different views, which I think nicely illustrates this point I'm trying to make about there isn't one single answer to various dilemmas. In relation to the consent issue, most of the researchers, though not all, felt that the verbal consent provided 2 years earlier was adequate. Responses to the issue of confidentiality were much more wide-ranging, perhaps as might be expected. Some researchers felt there was absolutely no justification for overriding the promise of confidentiality given to Dan. So we can see here elements of the principlist approach. So confidentiality should be paramount. You've made that promise, you can't go back on that, even though he's no longer here. But other people felt the situation warranted the disclosure of non-sensitive data. I think we can see here elements of a consequentialist approach. So thinking about outcomes, the outcomes for the parents might override that promise earlier made. And I'm just going to show you just some contrasting views in relation to these two issues. So firstly, in relation to consent. So one researcher responded, "My instinct is that you ought to contact Dan's next of kin, his parents, given that he was only 16 when he consented. Maybe that you need to remind them that you have the data and offer them a chance to consent to archive or request that Dan's data is withdrawn and destroyed." In contrast, another researcher said, "I feel it's not their decision to refuse whether Dan's data can be archived, as this was an agreement that you entered in with Dan, not his parents." And then in relation to the confidentiality issue, one person said, "I think considering offering his parents a sample of his voice would be to consider their feelings in the circumstances, rather than necessarily infringing Dan's privacy." But in contrast, another researcher said, "I think that his agreement to anonymity and confidentiality still stands. He hasn't revoked it. And honestly, ethically, I'm not sure how you can speculate on what he may or may not have wanted and how that may or may not have changed with time and circumstances." So, what did they do about this dilemma? Again, here's an excerpt from the website. So they noted there was no single solution, as I've been saying, really wanted to stress to these ethical dilemmas. And they refer to making a decision which they felt was the most morally caring in the circumstances. Because it respected Dan's wishes, but also was in the interest of his parents. They did decide that Dan's verbal consent was adequate to enable them to archive the data, and didn't feel they needed to get Dan's parents' permission as well. But they did offer Dan's parents the opportunity to archive any personal memories they had of Dan also in the archive if they wished to do so, and they did. And they also offered Dan's parents a sample of Dan's voice. So Dan's parents were very keen to take this up, and they were provided with a DVD of extracts from one of his interviews where he talked about his likes and his career aims. I think the decision that was made here, and knowing certainly one of the researchers quite well, indicates an ethics of care perspective. That will be the perspective that they were working with, in which care is central to the decision and all parties are considered. But we might also see here elements of virtue ethics in terms of the virtue of respectfulness, which is one of the virtues that Macfarlane talks about in relation to the negotiating phase of research. So I think that particular dilemma is very rich and provides quite a good illustration of how one might use those various different frameworks in making considerations of what to do. So I want to finish with just some very brief summary conclusions of this presentation. So I think all researchers have gut feelings about what the right thing to do in any situation is. When we encounter ethical issues or ethical dilemmas, we have a feeling about what the right thing is to do. And what I've tried to argue is that ethical frameworks can help researchers to think these through. Not to tell you what to do, but help you to think about, to evaluate and justify the gut feelings that you have. Secondly, researchers are likely to feel that one or other of the ethical frameworks that they fit with their fits with their moral views. And that's important to identify a framework that they have sympathy with and which will enable them to explore and justify the decisions that they make. And then thirdly, I've said here there are no answers. Probably a better thing to say is there's no one single answer. And I think that's nicely illustrated by the dilemma. So ethical frameworks, again, provide a means of thinking about ethical dilemmas and assessing what an appropriate and importantly defensible course of action might be, but they don't actually give us answers about what to do. And as I've said, individual researchers are likely to reach different conclusions about different ethical dilemmas. And I just finished with the cover of my book, which is out in November, which explores these things in a bit more depth and explores other ethical issues such as informed consent and all the various things that one encounters in qualitative research.